As a trauma survivor, I have always been interested in resilience. But growing up, I believed it was something that you were born with. Then in graduate school, I learned that it was a quality that we all possess and a set of skills we can all strengthen. Most of my resilience has come from writing and seeing myself in new ways by confronting the stories I've always told myself. The more I did that, the stronger I became, and I've dedicated my life to helping others do this work. This podcast is for anyone who wants to understand their story and how to revise it, because when we do that work, we change the world. My first introduction to Ronit Plank was through a coffee cup sitting on a colleague's desk. On it were the words, "Let's talk memoir." Soon after, I began listening to her award-winning podcast. 6 months after that, I had the privilege of meeting Ronit at the 2023 AWP conference, where I purchased her memoir, When She Comes Back, and her short story collection, Home is a Made-Up Place. I also got to give her a hug and discover just how lovely and talented Ronit is. She earned her MFA in Nonfiction Writing at Pacific University. She's won a Pushcart Prize and Best of the Net, among many other awards. Her work has been published in The Atlantic, The New York Times, Writer's Digest, and many other places. She is currently the Creative Nonfiction Editor at the Citron Review and leads memoir writing workshops both online and in person. To learn more about her books, awards, publications, classes, and to listen to her fantastic podcast, which you totally should, see her bio and all of the links in the show notes. Before we get to today's episode, I have a few questions for you. Have you ever written about someone who's abandoned you? What kind of feedback did you get? Do you wonder how to do this without making them a monster or abandoning yourself? Ever wonder what it might be like to publish this work or where you might publish it? These are just a few of the topics Ronit and I dug into during our interview. I hope you'll ponder these questions as you listen along. And now it's my great pleasure to share this interview with Ronit Plank. Are you a writer who struggles with doubts? Do you wonder if your stories are good enough? Do you wish you had some simple tricks that would make the writing life just a little bit easier? Become part of my Writing and Resilience community by signing up for my newsletter. As a thank you, you'll receive a free copy of Write More, Fret Less, 5 brain hacks that will supercharge your productivity, creativity, and confidence. The link is in the show notes. Well, hello, Ronit. I am so glad that you are here on the Writing and Resilience podcast. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Lisa. I'm really excited to be here.
Well, it is a huge joy for me. I remember seeing you at AWP last year, and you were shining and you were holding on to this book that I am holding up right now. For anyone who sees the video and you notice there's a place that is marked and then there's all of these underlines inside. And this is your short story collection, Home is a Made-Up Place, which is, I guess, what would you call that to your memoir? Do you call it the sequel? Or do you give it a different name?
I don't know. It's like my second book, which actually, and I know we're going to get into this in the interview a little bit later, but I wrote these stories, most of them prior to writing the memoir. And so the memoir became my debut, but the story collection got published later after winning an award and getting some traction. So they're similar themes, which I know we'll talk a little bit about, and they all have to do with sort of personal change and introspection and transformation, I think.
Well, I think this is a good point where you can tell us about it. So your memoir is When She Comes Back, and I'll also hold that up. I love this. I love your cover on both of these. So can you tell us about these books? And also, a thing I was curious about is there a way that they speak to each other?
Yeah, well, thank you for asking. So in a nutshell, When She Comes Back, which is the memoir, is the story of the loss of my mother, really my family, but the loss of my mother to the guru in the Wild Wild Country docuseries on Netflix, whose name was Bhagwan Shree Rajneesh. And she left several times during my childhood to follow Bhagwan, and my life changed dramatically. But before she left, my father actually left our very young family and went across the country after we all moved as a family away from Israel. So essentially, the memoir is the loss of my mother to the guru and our eventual reconciliation. But within that, it's a coming of age story, a New York story, an 80s story, a story of divorce and intergenerational trauma. And also, I would say, I don't like to use the word forgiveness necessarily because I feel like that's too pat for what I like to talk about in my writing and what I experience in the story, but acceptance or understanding about what happened in my family and its relation to who I am and what I've come to understand about myself. And then Home is a Made Up Place is a collection of short stories that I wrote over the course of my earlier writing years before I realized I wanted to write memoir. It was my deep mask phase where I was turning to fiction because I thought that's the best way to talk about what I felt like I needed to talk about without pointing the finger at myself or my family or the things that I personally experienced. So I was pretty much bending over backwards to create characters and situations which spoke to me, to work out themes that I didn't yet realize I was going to completely unveil later in the memoir. And so those short stories, I put them in a manuscript and sent them out and got like some decent traction with different contests, and then won a contest, and then a couple of years later it came out. So that's my suite of books right now, and I do think that they speak to each other in terms of family, identity, searching for one's importance and validity, trying to figure out what one needs from other people and what one has to find within themselves.
Oh my gosh, I relate to this so much because I started out as a fiction writer because I don't know, somehow it seemed like it would make the process safer. And yet it was when I started writing in memoir that I found my voice. And then, of course, now I'm also writing fiction, but I totally relate to that. And for me, some of the things that I related to with your books. So when we think about memoir and When She Comes Back, I am also a child of the 80s. So we have that generational thing going on. And I was relating to all of these different details in here. And even though my experience is different, I experienced a lot of abandonment with my mom. And so there was this really poignant tension throughout this memoir around, if I just do enough, she'll come back. If I just can be enough, she'll come back. And oh my gosh, it was punching me right in the heart.
Oh.
It was, and it's all the right ways. Like, I love it when a book does this, but I was just feeling that experience. And then the challenge of also being parentified. So it's like when your families are split and you're the oldest, there's so many ways you end up being in charge, and it can feel so powerful and yet scary, and it's lonely.
Yes.
And there's all of this stuff that goes on underneath. And so I loved all of that about your memoir, which I read first, and then I read your short story collection. And I think the best way to talk about it is that I felt haunted by your characters. You bring us to such specific places, and your details bring this to life so well that it just felt real to me. And
I'm so happy to hear that. Thank you.
I believed these characters so much. And, you know, several of the stories, and we're going to talk about one in particular, it just mirrored things I had seen or that I knew. And so I was like, oh my gosh, I feel like I'm right with these people and I know them. And I love that about
I'm so
it.
glad. You know, it's funny because when I think about writing fiction now, and I have started some different little flash pieces and stories, it just feels more haunting to me than it did in the past. And I don't know if I'll get back to it like you're writing fiction now, but I'm so close to some of these characters. And when I was editing it and checking out the whole manuscript for publication, it was hard. It was actually hard for me to revisit the experience of some of these characters. In fact, the story and selection you picked for me to read today was one of them where it had been so long since I lived in that space of writing that character and sort of feeling that experience that it sort of took my breath away a little bit. Like I had to kind of center myself and soothe myself a little bit to do it. And I do want to say that what's striking to me is that you just used the word parentified. And what I can't believe when I think about it now, but I never even heard that word, I think, until my late 30s or like my early 40s, which is, and it's so present in many of our lives. A lot of the people who are writing memoir or who have experienced trauma, and often those intersect. And I'm sure people listening to this podcast right now or reading these books, they've experienced parentification, they've experienced loss, they've experienced parents who aren't there for them the way they wish. And it's sad to me how common it is, but it's also very relatable.
Yeah, I definitely think it's very common. And I wonder if it's more common for our generation. Not to say that it doesn't happen now, because I definitely think it does. I used to be an inner city public school teacher, and I knew so many grown up eighth graders that were truly, I mean, living adult lives when they left school, which made it really difficult for them to function within the rules of school because suddenly someone's telling them what to do and they're like, I'm grown. I'm out here doing all these things in the world. So, yeah, I think it's a huge thing that people experience. And when we are parentified, which, if you don't know what that means, to be parentified is to be put in a role, in an adult role that you shouldn't be in when you're a child, that you are given all of these responsibilities. And often they're not just physical tasks, they're emotional tasks that you do for other people. And we often do that when someone is missing, which is what happened in your memoir. And so I'm curious what you learned about connection and abandonment through writing your memoir and through these stories that you wrote.
Yeah, well, thank you for asking about that. I think that I learned repeatedly in writing the memoir and going back and editing it. The first draft, the eking out of those scenes and major events is so different from the later experience of editing the material and unifying the voice and figuring out where my reflection needed to be amplified, etc. I mean, there's so many moving parts with memoir, as you know. But I think that for me, I really appreciated much more where my parents came from and their experience and their backstory, which I include in the memoir because I think it's relative. I think it's really all relative. And I learn memoir in such a way that we don't point fingers or just throw people under the bus. And even the most difficult people in our lives, those who we have relationships with that are the most fraught, we deserve and owe it to ourselves to show the relationship or put them in scene or dialogue so the reader understands with more nuance what that person means to us and how they show up in our lives and why we have these issues, these relationship problems, these sort of cords that keep us attached to them and keep kind of resonating within us that we can't free ourselves from. I learned that I had room within myself for kindness and vulnerability and for asking questions and for being brave enough also to show the parts of myself that I didn't want to show and to include scenes in there that I was really embarrassed about and that I was afraid people would judge me for or think I was unsavory or dirty for or, that I had it coming, things like that. That stuff is really scary to put on the page. But as I know we'll talk about later, I think the more you can go into the discomfort, the more you can go into the parts of yourself that you would rather not talk about, the better the reading will likely be for your readers. What I've learned is to be more open-minded, be more curious, to ask questions, and to try not to be afraid of what answers might be there.
I think that's a beautiful answer. And what I love about it is that you are taking the time to understand your characters because when someone abandons us, we can say, oh, that person is bad. Look at this terrible thing that they did. But everything in life happens within a context. And to be a good writer, you have to be able to show the context because flat characters are boring. I was at this reading with Jeanette Walls, and she talked about the fact that she had to do the work around what was happening with her parents because if they were all bad, it would just be boring. And I think, that's one way to look at it. But the more you can look at the context of what's happening in other people's lives, the more you can look at your own context. And that's where you get below the iceberg, right? And you really get into what's going on with your story. And when you do that work, not only is it deeper and richer, but you do something that I think is really important is you keep your side of the street clean. So that when your memoir comes out and there may be things that you have to share about yourself and about other characters that don't always paint them in the best light, you know that you've done the work to do justice to other people's stories, that you have been fair, that you have treated people with compassion. And when you do that, you're going to feel good about what you publish because later in life, the story you tell now is never the story that you're going to tell 10 years from now. And you want to feel like you did your due diligence.
I absolutely agree with you. I think that we can't foreshadow exactly how we'll feel later on. But I think if we know in our hearts, in our guts, that we did not ultimately act with vindictiveness or a sense of retribution for the people that may have caused us trouble in our lives and circumstances that we wish we didn't go through. I also love that you said context because even when I ask people what happened at school today, my kids or my friends. I'm always asking for context. Like, I haven't used the word itself in so long, but as soon as you said it just now, I realized, yes, I'm like a context aficionado, like not just in writing. I'm not patting myself on the back there, but I'm always like, well, what did you say? What did he say? What happened? How are you feeling? What happened before then? And why do you think they said this? So I'm always looking for clues. And of course, that's not to say that someone's experience isn't valid without those clues. I don't
Mm-hmm.
mean to say that. But I think that if you understand that my mom's mom was not a very maternal mom and took stuff out on her, then you kind of maybe understand where my mom's behavior or lack of caretaking in those moments came from. And it's not that I'm trying to have you root for her or root for me. Once you let that go, if you're focused on that, that's not going to really be as resonant in your manuscript. But when you look at telling a fuller story and to help the reader understand what you understand, and then you can even roll it around a little bit and say, it still doesn't make sense to me, or I'm still trying to figure it out. I'm a big fan of calling out on the page,
Mm-hmm.
even in writing prompts or in the final product, what is not making sense to you as a writer and a person.
Yeah, and I like that too because life continues and we don't wrap up our stories with a bow. And something you said that I think is really important for people to hear is that when you understand someone else's story, you begin to develop compassion for them and you understand how things work. And when you understand that, you can better understand your own story. And I'm like you, I'm always looking for the context of things. I think that's because I have this therapy background. And that's what my whole job was for a period of time. It's like, what is the context? Where does all this come from?
Yes, and the other thing I want to add on to that, which is something that I teach in my workshops, it's one of the workshop areas that we focus on, is that if somebody has caused harm or if there's someone that you're entangled with that you're writing about in your memoir, and I'm careful even to watch out about placing blame there, right? Because I'm just saying we're all very subjective, and I'm just trying to say that when you're illustrating a relationship, if you paint someone with one color and don't offer the nuance or a little bit more of the context, then it's going to be harder for your reader to understand exactly why this relationship has you in knots and it affects you the way it does. When you show the different ways in which this person has been with you or how they have affected you throughout their lives or different interactions, you help to sort of offer glue between you and that person that the reader can then see, sort of that connective tissue between you and that person in relationship, so that the reader understands why it's so hard for you to extricate yourself. We need to see, they say very few people are all evil anyway, right? There's always some human story underneath that. So rah rah for that. I totally agree with you.
Yeah, always. There's always something underneath that. And everybody, no one is terrible every day of the year. No one. And we
Right.
think about the most evil person you can imagine. There was
Yeah.
a day when they did something good or pleasant or helpful. I'm going to talk about this in a couple of different ways. But when we focus on the bad thing that someone else did to us, we keep ourselves in the victim role. And when I say
Mm.
victim role, I'm not talking about anyone being bad. It's just a state of powerlessness. And a good story is about you being the hero. So there's a
Oh,
way
yes.
that when you begin to understand these things and you understand your own decisions and you understand these sticky points and these knots, you can begin to see yourself as a decision maker, someone who played a role. And that doesn't mean you deserved anything that happened to you, but there's a way that you make decisions, and that's how you get to that arc of change. So that's a really
Yes.
important thing to get to, but you may not start there. And so, what I
Yes.
often tell people is that in your first draft, you may need to write the most victimiest version of the story that you could possibly write. Make that other person as terrible as you need to, not because that's the final draft, but because there is a wounded part of you that needs to speak. And what that part of you needs to say is, I am hurt. And when
Yeah.
you allow that part of you to speak, and then you can look at it and say, ah, that's one version. What else? Right? It's
Yes. I
not
love
instead
that.
of, it's what else? So this and
Yes.
more. Then you can begin to build it without feeling like you have to deny the hurt story that you've been carrying.
Oh, I just love that. And that reminds me of some prompts that we do as well, because I think it's always good to excavate and to sort of shine a light on all those parts. Again, the parts that you may not want to talk about, the parts you're worried about, the parts you're embarrassed about. And this reminds me when you talked about being in action, and I'm paraphrasing, but for example, there's this one scene in my memoir where this boy likes me at summer camp. It's a sleepover that night for a day camp, and he really likes me and I really like him, but I'm terrified. And so I decide to pretend I have a fever. I'm like 12 or 11, so that I won't have to go to camp because I'm dying. I do not want to be alone with this guy. I'm freaking out. So I do this thing. I orchestrate this thing so my father thinks that I have a fever and I don't have to go. And I'm like, thank goodness, right? So now I could look at that and write that as I was so afraid I couldn't possibly go. Wow, wow, wow. But in that moment, which I open up a little bit and make a full scene, because there's a lot of rumination there as well and reflection, I am noticing my pattern and what I'm doing to avoid the closeness that I'm so afraid of. And so that's being in action in some way, right? It's not just reporting events or, oh, why does this always happen? Or I was so scared, and that you're just shaking in some corner. I'm doing something, even as an 11 or 12-year-old, to make a decision. And again, I'm not talking about everyone is responsible for everything that happens to them. I'm talking about when you're writing the story, you can look for the patterns and the ways that you created things in your life because of who you are. Because somebody else would have maybe gone to the sleepaway, or somebody else would have been like, stand up to their father and say, I'm not going because I'm so afraid. But I was hiding that. So, that all of us, we personalize everything as we write our memoir.
And when you can do that, you make the work interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So that's about some of the writing, which is incredible. And then there's the publishing process, which is its own beast and its own interesting journey.
Oh, yes.
And when we have difficult experiences in our lives, abandonment, we can have a lot of fear. And we can carry that fear into a process, which on the outside is supposed to look so joyous, so great, so amazing. And then anybody who's started writing a memoir about all of the fears that can be lurking in the background. And you have this incredible Writer's Digest article, which is going to show up in the show notes so people can read it. And one of the things that you said in this article, which is how to approach family and friends about your memoir, you had this quote about why you decided to share your work with others before it was published. And you said, and most importantly, I wanted to make sure that they wouldn't disown me after it went to press. Now, you have worked so hard to not just write about these relationships in a compassionate way, but you've worked hard to navigate these relationships, which, if anyone who reads your memoir knows, it's tricky. Mm-hmm. How did that trickiness and all of the hard work you had put into building good relationships with people that that had started out complex, or that it had all of these nuances to, how did that affect your feelings about the publication process?
Thank you for asking that and for your kind words about the article. That I really enjoyed sourcing that and asking for feedback from different memoirists. And I do want to say that, like so much of our writing process and publishing journeys, this is all very personal and individual. So I leave space for everyone's choices when it comes to how to deal with the manuscript. Some people want to wait until the people they're writing about have passed. In fact, I just interviewed on my podcast someone who thought that her mom would be gone by the time her memoir found publication, but actually is still going strong, and that's all good. But she had to contend with what to do, and she said she almost pulled it. But then she was listening to Let's Talk Memoir. I swear she just said this, and she heard what we were talking about, and she decided, okay, I'm going to just go with this. So it's very personal. You have to go with what feels right to you. Get centered and think about it. It's a big decision because we all want that book in the world. We really do. And one day it will be in the world. So don't rush it. And this also speaks to do your copy edits, do your developmental edit. Don't rush it. You will have, if you knew that you were going to have a book in the world, wouldn't you want it to be as great as it can be, as fully formed as it can be before you do it? So don't rush that process. It will happen if you want it to happen. It's a lot of work, but you can do it. For me, I have my family in my life. I have three main players in my nuclear family: my sister, who's younger, my dad, and my mom. They are divorced, my parents, but we see each other for dinners often. So there we are talking about the olden days at the table. My sister lives in a different state. So I knew that I couldn't just ta-da, here's a story about you at large, enjoy. Like, I just was not something I could do because I'm in relationship with them. So once I knew I had a publishing deal, not before, I wrote in secret. I wrote in my MFA program the first draft, and let me tell you that my mom was a little nervous when I told her I moved from fiction to memoir. Her face fell because I think everyone in the family knew, oh, what is this memoir going to be about but your childhood? So after it was ready and I had my deal and I knew it was going to go to press, I gave a manuscript copy to each of them and I let them review it, in part because I wanted them to tell me if there was anything glaringly wrong, if they had corrections. I wanted to just to make sure they saw it. And my sister admitted that it was strange to read about herself as a character in a book, but good, fine. My father gave me 9 pages of single-spaced notes, which I've talked about a lot. And my mom was actually relieved that she looked better in it than she worried about. And ultimately, we got through it. It did cause a little bit of, I don't know, distress in the family. It was a little sort of like the elephant in the room. And my mom, the funniest thing that my mom said to me later on was in the year of my launch, which was in 2021, she said, it was supposed to be a small book, just a really, really small book. And now it's got this orange cover with these giant letters, when she comes back. And now it's a bigger book. And she's like, this wasn't supposed to happen. And so she jokes about it. And then finally, when I told her the short story collection was coming out, she said, oh, thank God we're done with the memoir. But my mom listens to my podcast and she loves talking about memoir. And she's beginning to write a little bit now. And, you know, she's just so welcoming. And anyone who's read my book, you know, they're probably like, wait, what? You went from like close Shabbat dinners to now your mom is like learning how to write memoir and she's interested in memoir. And like, we talk about it all the time. So I have to say the surprise ending, epilogue, post-epilogue is that my mom and I are actually closer now than we even were 2 years ago. So I don't even know how to explain that.
I love that. And I think some things you said that are both wise and in alignment with what I share is it's always a personal choice. And you have to figure out what is going to help you tell your truth in a way that is safe, that keeps your side of the street clean, and also is honoring other people and their autonomy. But I always tell people, do not tell family members when you're doing your early drafts, because then they're going to want to know more about it. It's scary for them, of course.
Yes.
Right? It's very powerful for you to start writing about this. It's very terrifying for other people. So honor that and honor yourself. Don't tell people right away. And
it's nobody's business in the beginning at all.
Exactly. If you need to tell anyone, get a writing group. All those people, don't tell anyone else.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, the timing of when you share pages with people is so important. And that's because so much changes over the course of the revision process. That thing that you thought that was so important and so right in draft 1 is going to be so different in the final draft.
Gosh. You're so right. Yes. Like, what if you show it to them and it's really, really raw, or it hasn't really been finished, or you haven't really taken a look at it, and you show it to them and you hurt feelings and you worry everyone, and then you actually don't even publish that in the end. You're so right.
Yeah. I mean, and I tell people, if, when you have a deal, like a traditional publishing deal, you're going to go through an editorial process. And I often encourage people to wait till editorial is pretty much done and the book is really set. Like, imagine it like a cake, and you've taken it out of the oven and, you touch that top and it springs back. That's the place when you can tell people, because then you can be confident that the details are the right details. I mean, obviously not before galleys go out, and there are other parts of the process where things can't be changed, but before final changes are made, but after that editorial process, because so much can change.
I love that cake analogy, by the way. I also love cake, but like, you want it to
spring the
back.
Best.
It's the best. And like, if it's too soon, it's gooey in the middle. It's very vulnerable and soft. It's not ready. And so that's how you can feel as a memoirist with a brand new manuscript, or even in your 3rd or 4th or whatever revision. You feel like, fragile, this baby thing that you just birthed. When you have a deal, when it's really happening, it's harder to pull the plug or change anything. And then it's really moving into this, I'm going to be a published author. It's moving into the space of wearing this published memoir, published book mantle on you. Like, you deserve it. You did the work. You've done all the things. You've had a great coach like you, or you've taken great classes from someone like you, and you are ready. You're stronger and more fortified because you've not only worked hard on your manuscript, but you've vetted it with trusted readers who understand the genre.
I love that. And I'm going to ask you a question. And I always send people questions in advance. And then I think, oh, I really want to ask this question. And this is a question I've been asking people because as of the time of this recording, I'm in the middle of this 3-part webinar series with Jane Friedman called The Psychology of Memoir. And one of the things I'm getting ready to talk about is how do you know your work is done? And this is my theory. The work finishes itself inside you and in your body first, and then on the page. How did you know that your book was done? What did it feel like, and what was going on in the book itself that told you, yes, this is the final draft?
Great. So first of all, love Jane Friedman and all the work she does. And so shout out to Jane Friedman, who has brought so many people so many tools and resources. And wow, that you're teaching for her. How lucky those students are. So I want to say that this has a little bit to do with structure, and you can definitely start giving me the hook if I go on too long. But what I want to say is, when I began the memoir, I really didn't know where to start the story, where to end it, because our stories go on. You can keep writing your story and how you are processing your past. You could always write that. But I knew that I wanted to end in childhood. I didn't want to get into my married life, but I could have. I could have written through the lens of a married woman with children and constantly gone back and forth, definitely. But I wasn't ready to approach my grown-up material with my parents yet. So I stayed from birth until 14. Chronologically, that was kind of how I did it, but back and forth a little bit with my reflections and some reference. So I knew I needed to end it then, but I wasn't sure what would end it. And I love I'm going to paraphrase the great person who said this, maybe many of us say it, but if you end up where you think you're going to end up when you're done with your manuscript, you may have more work to do, because it's the surprises of where you end up in your story and how you finish it off that will sort of reflect the change you've gone through as a memoirist. And so I thought I was going to end when my mom left for the second time. Boom. But then my mom and I had this kind of watershed conversation, which I put into the epilogue. Now, this was also a choice. And I felt so good about that. Like, I was done with the manuscript, and then we had this conversation. I thought, oh my gosh, that's the ending. And so I added it because I had actually, this is how obnoxious I am. My mom and I begin to have a heart to heart. And I said, whoa, Mom, can I record this? I've got my phone right here. And that woman is so long suffering. I can't believe I did that to her, but I was able to verbatim get some of what I knew was about to happen. And I was able to put it in my book. And that really, I feel like, helped to offer something fresh to the book. Now, I will say, devil's advocate, one could argue that I should have given it even more time and gone back and maybe worked on the material through the lens of knowing I had this conversation with her. You could say that, but this is the way I chose to do the book. And I haven't reread it since it came out in 2021, except for readings and guest things that I've done. And I do worry that when I read it again, if I do in 10 years or so, I'll cringe and think, I can't believe this is the book I put out there. But it's the best I could do at that time. And another answer to that too is I had several editors. Oh, and going back to something we talked about a few minutes ago, one of my editors said to me at my master's program, you kind of got a little bit of a woe is me, Eeyore lost his tail thing going on. And I thought, that I definitely don't want in my memoir. And that was like 3 years before the final, but that's why you really want your trusted readers.
Absolutely. You need people that are going to tell you the truth. And I love what you said about, if you know where you're going to land, it means you probably have more work to do. And I was on a panel with John Pineda earlier this year for the James River Writers. And John said, memoir is about discovery, right? And so that's the spirit you want to bring to this process. It's not about what you know and then what you're going to teach the reader. Well, you're the first person you got to teach. So teach yourself something, discover, and then you'll be able to support other people in a much better way. Because when you think you have it all figured out, you are controlling the narrative. And the narrative is not teaching you anything. And the reader is going to recognize that. They're going to see it.
they'll tune out perhaps because they'll be like, here we go again. Readers are so smart. They pick so much up from us. They're smart. They want to learn, especially memoir readers, I would argue. They're little sleuthers. I mean, we love to sleuth a little bit when we're reading and understand what's really going on. And this is something I want to ask you when you come onto my podcast, but I really have to ask you because of your background in counseling and all of your trauma informed coaching. Have you worked with people who have brought you their manuscripts and they haven't done a lot of the work that you feel like they might need to do, and that maybe they're not going to get what they need out of their manuscript until they do?
Hmm. Oh yeah. I meet with people all the time who are brand new to this genre and they feel called because they have a big wound.
Yeah.
And the first thing that I tell all writers is that you want to go through therapy first. And it's fine to write about things, but when you're working on a memoir, it's about making sense of what happened, not reporting what happened. And you need someone skilled at the feelings part who can do that work with you and just hold space for that without the pressure of some kind of manuscript or product. So, all right, so we've talked a little bit about publishing, we've talked about your memoir. Then you have this gorgeous short story collection, and you have this story, Gibbous. And I want to talk for a minute about why this was so meaningful to me. I spent 7 years as an inner city special education teacher, and I worked with a lot of kids who had autism spectrum disorder. And one of the things that I had to do was meet with parents for these meetings where you're telling them, that their child has a diagnosis. When I was reading that story, I was right back there in the classroom or in one of those meetings and talking with these parents and seeing what it's like to then go home. And my heart was just breaking in some ways for the beauty of the love that you rendered between this mother and son. I was always imagining, like, what happens when they go home? What is dinner like? What is bedtime
Mm-hmm.
like? What are all these things like? You gave me a vision for what that is. So, can you tell us what was your inspiration for the story?
Yeah. So this story is called Gibbous, which is named for a phase of the moon, which does come up in the story, but also it refers a bit to the incompleteness or the way that we might see something as not what it could be. And again, that theme that I kind of work with. And so this is about a single mom named Johanna who has a son named Wade. She's lost her mom not too long ago. She doesn't have a partner in her life. And he's got a lot of allergies and asthma and eczema and really sometimes disfiguring skin conditions. And it's really hard for her, but she kind of has it under control to an extent. And then she realizes that there's more going on, which is what you're referencing, that the professionals mentioned. My experience was one in which I have two children, and one of my children had really very troublesome skin conditions when they were younger. And we had to go to so many different doctors to try to figure out what was going on. Kind of an atopic dermatitis situation. I wrote about it for Salon, actually. So if you want to read the story as I was going through it, not the autism spectrum part, the
Mhm.
skin part, there's an essay that was one of my first big, oh, I'm writing something personal that's going to be seen by more people. And I wrote it when he was younger. And that kind of talks a little bit about what we went through. But we had to go to an outpatient program for skin care. And we were there for like 8 days, 9 days. We traveled out of state when my daughter was young and my other kid was even younger, my son. And it was hard. And we did a lot of sessions with other parents and we saw lots of other children. We were going through a really hard time family wise and emotionally. And I was feeling that. And I also was witnessing it. So this is based on that. But of course, extrapolated to include a woman who's not me in a state that's not where I live, et cetera, et cetera.
What I love about this story is that there's a real aspect to it, right? There's this experience of having a child who has this skin issue that is difficult to diagnose and understand. And from a story perspective, when I think about Wade, I felt like there was so much beneath the surface in terms of the pain that he was experiencing in wanting to be liked and wanting to belong. And just wanting to be like all the rest of the kids, to go on the field trip, to be well enough to go on the field trip. There's all this hope that's mingled with this pain. And the skin disorder gives us a physical manifestation of this internal peace. And you don't have to share all of these reflections around, Wade's inner world. We see him itching. We see all of these actions that he does. And then we're like, oh, it makes it even more real.
Yeah, I love that little boy. Like talking about him now. And also what I didn't touch upon is, I guess in these stories, because there's a few kids that show up in this collection, including one at the end in the plan. And I do feel, as a teacher, I first started teaching, well, adults, but then children for a long time, and now adults. And I have like a really, really soft, very open spot for children, vulnerable people, vulnerable animals, but the vulnerability of the dependent, the vulnerability of those that can't make a decision on their own for themselves, and how often we miss those people, or those people get missed, even in the slightest of moments, where if they could be seen by their teacher, their caregiver, a friend, it can make all the difference. And I've been on both sides, or like so many of the sides. So I think that was important to me.
I want to go to every school, and I want to pass this story out to the teachers for the first day of school, and just have them carry Wade in their hearts, so that on the tough days when things go poorly, as they always do, because we're humans, and humans do interesting things that don't always work well with our humanness, you can remember this little boy, right? And this little heart that is residing maybe in someone who isn't doing exactly what you'd like, and all of those hopes and dreams, because it gets lost sometimes. And we can't forget that. Like, this is the most important part, is to really hold on to the heart that people have, and these desires. And I think that's one of the things I really loved. So would you be willing to read a short excerpt from that story?
Yes. This is just after they've come home from being called into the principal's office about Wade's behavior. So now they're home. Okay. Wade has 1 foot in the tub and 1 foot out, and bath water is everywhere. You edge him back into the tub, but he rises out of the water again, shivering, his jaw snapping more urgently than usual. You hold on to his mottled arms. Wade, you speak as calmly as you can, your face close to his ear, you have to get in. You press him down toward the bath, and quickly, before he gets up again, you splash water on his neck with a plastic bowl. He screams in an otherworldly decibel, and you wonder again how so much sound can come from such a tiny, damaged chest. He snatches the bowl out of your hands and throws it at you. You jam your lips together to hold back the words about to explode out of your mouth, and clamp his arms down at his sides. He kicks a slippery leg out of the tub, climbs out, and runs down the hallway toward his bedroom, his skinny, bendy straw limbs flailing. Damn it, Wade, you yell. Get back here. Exhausted, you yank the towel off the hook. You're going to slip, you say, but no, he can't hear you anymore. With heavy steps, you start your 10 count and trudge down the narrow hall. Photos of you and Wade, your late mother and Wade his dog before you'd had to give the dog away because of Wade's allergies, are on the left wall. Framed drawings Wade made are on your right. For the longest time, he drew his people's mouths as lines straight across. He couldn't seem to make the curve of a smile. You remember how that was something you used to worry about, back before his ADHD was diagnosed, before your mother died, before you were so much on your own. You shake your head. Now it would be a gift to worry about something as small as that. You follow sloppy wet footprints into his small room where they end at his bed. He is naked and huddled underneath. A gray dust bunny clings greedily to his pointy elbow. Come out, baby. He stares at you. Come out before you dry up so we can get your medicine on you. His jaw snaps twice fast. You sit on your heels, your head jammed under the bed, and try several more times. Leaning on your haunches in the darkening room, your forearms resting on your thighs flattened against your calves, your body settles a little. It is a comfort to stop moving, a kind of peace. When Wade looks this bad, you need to slick him with ointments, get him into his pajamas, and put socks onto his hands and feet so he won't scratch his skin open in his sleep. You have to duct tape the socks on so he won't peel them off. He's so hot all the time, he can hardly stay in his clothes. And he calls for you at least once a night. The itching is always worse then. You rest next to him half asleep until his eyes close and his breathing settles. You pick apart your gummy thoughts, trying to make your head work so you can figure out what else you can do to make his life better. Like you always tell him, it's going to get easier. You just have to get through some more hard stuff for a while. You refocus your eyes on the naked heap in front of you. Wade's skin is drying fast. You have to get his medicine on him. And now I'm just going to read that one paragraph. When it's a few days later, when they're going to see a specialist. On the morning of your appointment with Dr. Shire, you pick up some donuts and chocolate milk for Wade. He tells about 100 knock-knock jokes while he eats, and you laugh at almost all of them, which gets him going too, so he tells another and another. In your rear view mirror, you see his big grin, the dimple on his left cheek back in its place. That is your real son, the one you can have most of the time if you could just get everything under control.
I love that juxtaposition.
You know, thank you for having me read that. And also, I want to say something that occurred to me as I was reading it was also this idea of strength and power and how this containment that again, people are not all one thing. And here's this single mom trying to take care of her son, but she's rageful, she's angry and frustrated. And she has to sort of moderate that so she doesn't hurt her son. But the power is there. It's very possible. And then there's this boy who's so frail in some ways, but is totally energized and strong. And it's sort of just like that push-pull that also struck me as I was reading it that I haven't thought about in a while. And also the responsibility of caretakers to not use their power and their force on those they are charged with taking care of.
It's a huge responsibility and also can be so hard when you're feeling so depleted and overwhelmed. And that's what I see in this mother character is how, we think about poverty, how poor she is in support and how poor she is in probably time and energy and all of these other things. And then she has this child with tremendous needs and how sometimes those needs can outweigh us. And there is never a justification for violence. There isn't. But you can have compassion for how hard it is for someone to reel it back in when the day to day is so difficult. So you published both books with Motina Press. Now that doesn't happen all the time, especially now. There's a lot of people you publish with one press, then you publish with another. Why did you publish both books with the same press, and what has your experience been like?
I was really happy to find Motina Books. I'd done some of the Asian stuff on my own before I knew my writing community, before I knew you, before I knew about Jane Friedman. I was really kind of cobbling it together. I'd been so much in the MFA and like writing craft world for so long without overlapping into any marketing or understanding of how to be an actual author in the world. And that's okay, but I needed to learn some of that. And so I had requests for full, and it became apparent to me slowly that I realized, oh wow, it's not going to just be like someone like rings some magic bell and then the book is going to be in the world. If I keep sending this out and waiting, then they have to go on submission, and then like I have to actually get a publisher who wants this, and then it could be 2 to 3 years, who knows how long. And I realized, wow, I want this book out there. I've been working on it for a while. I felt actually pregnant with the book. I felt like I needed to have the book baby. And when I connected with Diane at Motina, we really got along, and her communication skills are so good, and she has integrity, and I was thrilled to work with her. And we started meeting after we signed the contract and dealt with like edits and stuff. We would meet every month, every 2 weeks until the launch, then every week. Like we were just really on top of it to make sure everything was squared away. And then I had another publisher, the people who had given me my award. I got the Eludia Award for fiction in 2020. And then there was just a long wait for publishing, made worse by COVID. And then communication got a little bit spotty. And I mentioned that to Diane at Motina, and I just kind of talked about what was happening. I still hadn't signed a contract with the other place, and I was sort of getting worried. And Diane was lovely, and we'd been working together for 2 years already. So she said, I'll publish your short story collection. And I was like,
Nice.
wow, she loved the fiction. She said, I like your memoir, but if you write more fiction, I want it. She really likes my fiction. So I said, thank you. And yes. And so I already had the cover. I have two different cover designers for each book had a different designer. I had this one already for more than a year because I thought the book was coming out. And all we had to do is I had to get the assets to Diane, and she went for it. And she does what she says she's going to do. She knows her platform. She knows how to get books into the hands of the people who need it. She's adding more and more authors all the time. A lot of them I think you and I have in common. And yeah, like I think that what I've learned also is that, and this is the good news and the bad news, no matter who you are, unless they're going to throw tons and tons of money at your tour, your book tour and your press, you're going to have to work really hard and hustle to get your book in front of people. And so whether you go with a small press, a big press, an agent or not, you're going to have to hustle. And I know through doing my podcast and talking to so many wonderful writers, being on panels at AWP, like you mentioned, it takes a lot of work. And to me, it was really, let me get my book in the world and work with someone who I trust. I'm going to have to do a lot of work on the back end anyway. So it was a good contract. It's been really good. My royalties come in as they should. She's great. So, and that's how that happened.
And that is a wonderful experience. And, I always like to ask people about their publishing journeys because they can be so different. And some things that you said that I think are really important is number one, you have to think about how quickly do you want your book to come out in the world? And the bigger the publisher, the longer that time is going to be.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's one thing you want to think about. But you also want to think about who is going to be the champion for your book. And I think some writers want to publish with like the biggest press because I think it's going to give them the most prestige. But unless you're what they call the darling, that
Mm-hmm.
one or two
We know some of them,
authors,
we know
right? We
some of them,
do,
but
we
yeah,
do. And
yeah.
unless you're those, one or two authors per publisher that they're going to throw all the resources at, you are going to have to work as hard
Yeah.
as you would if you are self-publishing or with a small press. So making sure someone is going to edit your work well, that they are going to champion your book, that they're going to do what they say, that they're going to get your arcs out on time, which if you don't know what that is, that's your advanced reader copy. You want to make sure that gets out on time so that reviews come in. You want to make sure that pre-orders come in early enough that you can create some buzz.
Yes, and also even that you can collaborate with someone, that if you don't really agree for the vision on something or a font, that they're open to you and they're not going to strong arm you. I think that also having Let's Talk Memoir become this little niche, I think has been great for me versus my other podcasts, which I've done. I really enjoy the niche. And I'll tell you, I get press releases more frequently now than I used to from agents and from publishing houses who would like me to have their authors on my show. And so what you see here is a range of people at different levels and calibers who have their press offices or PR firms that they've hired on their own doing this for them. Like I'm no giant fish or anything. I have a show and I do my hard work on it because I love it, but they're approaching me of all different levels. And so what I'm trying to say is like, everyone's hustling. And if you're someone, I would say, who doesn't want to do a lot of the hustle, hire a PR firm. It's probably worth the money, someone who can do your book launch for you. But the bad news is you're still going to have to hustle because there's no magic formula. There is no magic formula except showing up again and again, just like you do for writing.
Absolutely. And Courtney Mom, if you don't get her newsletter, you should. She had a whole thing on hiring a publicist, which can be so expensive.
It
I
is
mean,
so expensive. But that's why your writing community, everyone, is so important, because when you have a writing community and people who love you and your work and want to champion it, they will post for you and they will tell their friends to get the book. So first write a really good book and make sure people are editing it for you. Find a way to get it out there, and then make sure your friends will help you. And that's all about that sort of reciprocity, and that being a good literary citizen, that might get you farther than hiring a PR firm, a publicist.
absolutely. And if you read Courtney's newsletter and that post, you will see that that is very true. So be a good literary citizen, be a part of the community because, most books are sold by word of mouth. And What you want to do is build that community authentically. Like, don't be creepy and be like, oh, that person's got a platform. I think I'm going to get to know them, right?
Yeah,
You don't do
yeah.
that, but get to know people and think, how can I be of service, right? How
Yes.
can I support? How can I highlight? How can I push people forward? Because when I do that, whether that exact person helps me out, I have put that energy out and it is going to come back to me tenfold because other people
Yes.
are going to support me.
Yes, and also something I learned and I continue to learn is that there is room for us all. So don't worry, you're not the only one who wrote a book like this. There will be other people like you, but they're not exactly like you, and there is room for all of us.
Absolutely. And I've seen some fantastic panels and readings where people are, there's something thematic that's the same, or maybe it's a similar kind of story, and it's beautiful to see something that is similar paired side by side because you see the differences and it amplifies all of these things that these people do. And so it's amazing. So speaking of your podcast, I want to talk about that for a second because it is
Okay.
amazing. And y'all, if you're not listening, you need to listen, especially if you're a memoirist. She does amazing interviews, and she also it's just so well crafted. I mean, there's a reason why you're winning awards, Ronit. There is, because you do a great job. What have you learned from your guests?
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. So, two things that I've really learned. I love doing this show. I would love to have more listeners. I think that I've been so lucky to have people want to talk to me, and I'm so happy to have that time to do it. And it's a labor of love, as you know. We don't make a lot of money as podcasters if we make any. So I think that also keeps me kind of clear eyed and focused on it because as soon as I don't like doing it anymore, I'll stop doing it. But I find myself really interested and I read all the books and I come up with the questions just like you do. And so it's really about engaging with the work and the writer and really trying to get in there and kind of connect. And I think that's what you're doing too. And so for me, that's fun. And also, I'm so nosy. I realize it's like the first time this year that I've realized, oh, I'm a really nosy person, which is why I'm enjoying reading nonfiction and memoir a lot more these days than fiction right now, because I always want to know, but what really happened? So that's why I'm perfectly suited right now to do this, and it makes me super happy. So two pieces of advice that I brought today for you that I have learned from my guests is one from Deborah Gortney, which is if you don't tell your story, somebody else is going to tell it for you. And I
Mm.
know people have heard versions of this, but Deborah Gortney was my very first guest for episode 1. She launched the series. I worked with her for my MFA, and so wise and memoir empowering. And then Jill Chrisman said, "You're the only one who can tell your story." And I know those sound similar, but they're different. So one is sort of like, well, if you don't do it, somebody else is. Like my dad and mom and sister can write the story, but they're not going to write it from my version of what happened. And I'm the only one who can tell the story that I see the way I see it now and how I want to convey it. And so that's why there is room for your story. There's room for all of us.
Absolutely. And I love Deborah Gortney. She's
Yeah,
amazing.
I
So I'm
know.
so glad that you got to work with her. What helps you be a resilient writer?
Okay, so I want to home in on this. I try to stay curious. I try to be curious and ask questions. And my advice for myself and a big takeaway that I've learned in these last couple of years is move into the not knowing how you will answer a question, whether in your life or in writing, how you will find the end for a piece of writing. Move into not knowing because being curious, it costs nothing and it keeps you alive and growing as a writer and a human. So it's like the easiest thing you can do is to be curious and keep learning and be open, and that helps you on a resilient human level as well as a writer and a memoirist level.
And if you didn't know this, curiosity is one of the 7 C's of resilience.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes, that is one of them. And being curious, you know, when we are going about life and we can either be shameful or we can be curious, and you can't be both together, right? Because when you're shameful, it's
Mm,
about I'm bad and it's about closing down, it's about seeing the problems.
mhm.
When you're curious, you are open to seeing things in a different way. And so curiosity counteracts shame. So it's a huge thing to do. And I'm so glad that that is a piece of who you are because your curiosity allows you to be a bright light in the world.
Well, thank you. And I also want to say that, the juxtaposition of this is that, as we end, is that I used to be, my fear and all that had happened to me kept me rigid. And I have to watch that. Type A, rigid. I was very blocked off in ways. Friendly, I don't think people would say I wasn't friendly, but very, very closed and protected in some ways. And part of the work I've done as a grown or upper, like more grown up now than I've ever been, is to learn how to, look at the parts of myself I don't want to look at, and to cop to the stuff that I do, the garbage that I do. And that's what helped me become a better writer. So it was therapy, it was working on myself, and it was realizing that I don't have to fortify myself, like I don't have to fortress up, to move throughout the world. I can be open and stay gooey, like that cake we talked about, while I'm forming my ideas and relationships.
Okay, so we should create some sort of product that says "Stay gooey." I vote for that. I vote for that. Stay gooey.
It's sort of weird. It kind of gives me a weird feeling, but it might be worthwhile. I don't know. Yeah, stay gooey.
People will at least be thinking about it, right? They'll be thinking about it, and that's the most important part. Well, if people want to stay in touch with you, they want to know more about the podcast, they want to see what you're doing on social media, what is the very best way for people to contact you and stay in touch?
Oh, thanks for asking. Find my name, Ronit Plank, and I'm mostly on Instagram, social media wise. I'm everywhere, but I post there the most regularly. And I also have a website, ronitplank.com, which has my podcast, my books, my workshops, the whole thing, my blog. Yeah. So find me there.
And if you didn't catch that, it will be in the show notes, so you will be able to link to it very easily. I want to thank you so much for being here today. This has been a lovely conversation. It has been so great to get to know more about you, and I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you for having me. It was delightful, Lisa. Thank you.
Hey writers, have you started a memoir only to get lost in a sea of stories that never seems to end, or completed a few drafts and now wonder if the structure you've chosen for your memoir is the best one for your book? Or have you queried a few agents only to hear, sorry, it's not for me, or worse, radio silence? You might not know this, but structure is the concept writers struggle with most. They worry about it during their first drafts and all along the way. There's a very good reason why this happens. An ineffective structure can lose readers, trap you in an endless cycle of revision, or worst of all, get you so lost you give up. But that doesn't have to happen to you. On February 21st, I'm teaming up with Jane Friedman to bring you Find the Memoir Structure That Works for You. During this webinar, you'll discover why writers crave structure and why stories need them. You'll also learn how to assess your skills and vision for this project, explore the most common memoir structures, and find out what skills are needed to nail each one. Best of all, it's only $25. That's right, $25. Plus, you don't even have to be available on February 21st because everyone who registers will get the recording, transcript, Q&A, and my comprehensive workbook. To learn more or register, go to janefriedman.com/courses or make it super easy on yourself and just click the link in the show notes. You'll leave with a new understanding of not just how stories are told, but confidence in your vision for your book, as well as a clear plan for getting there. To find the memoir structure that works for you, click on the link in the show notes, then register for this course. That's it for today's episode. Before you leave, I would love your help spreading the word about this podcast. You can do this in a few very simple ways. Click on the subscribe button in the upper right-hand corner, then leave a 5-star review. You can also let me know what you think or share ideas for the podcast by connecting with me on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, or through my Writing Your Resilience newsletter, which you can have delivered directly to your inbox.